All right, so let's continue with random numbers, right? So random numbers are nice because sometimes when you run your program, you want to generate some kind of values in random. It's used a lot in game programming, and it can also be used for things to do some kind of random to choose some kind of random selection of path in your programming. Right? So random numbers is basically a series of numbers whose orders can be predicted, right? So we can't really, or we can't really or predict these random numbers being generated. In practice, finding truly random numbers is really hard, right? Because it's a computer program, it does follow certain algorithms, and getting purely randoms as what we see in the natural world is not really an easy task, right? It's very hard to actually get really random, right? So what we call random numbers generators are usually a pseudo random number generator, right? They're not exactly random, they're pseudo random, right? In essence, they're random enough for the type of applications that we develop and are being used in a program. Right? All C++ compiler provide two general purpose functions for generating random numbers. One is called ran, and the other is called sran. Right? Now, if we look into this program here, whenever you want to use a random numbers, you basically need these two libraries include C standard library and the C time library, right? So include these two in your program, and uh, and then you can use some kind of a the function random or sran here, right? So here is an example, the function we create variables, right? A constant integer number equals to 10, some double random value, and then we call the sran function, and then we use the random function, right? So random value equals to ran, and the output of the program would just throw out some random values, right? And this value should be different every time you run it, right? Depending on basically when you run it, it will produce different output, right? And we're going to see why that is. We did put a time component in here that would basically randomize those things, right? Okay, randomize those things according to time, right? So so if you want to generate a random number here, right? So the sran basically puts a seed into the random generator, right? And we're using time component to make it depend, some kind of a input to make it different every time, right? So if you want it to be the same every time, you would put this as a static value, and it will produce the same random numbers every time, right? Okay, let's look at this, right? Using namespace standard here, and we include the two C standard library that we need, right? And calling ran here, right, which will output some random values from 26 characters, right? So if we want to choose a random alphabet, right, and we know uh, um, there's basically 26 characters in an alphabet, right? So the best way to do this is, and whatever the number is being generated, we would mod it with 26, thereby returning a value either 0 or 25, right? And if this number is then added with 65, because that's where the character number starts. A start with 65, and then 66, 67, right? So if we have a letter that is type character, right, and character number 65 is a capital A, for example, then the C out of the letter would come out, right? A, right? So, and we can do this in a loop, and you can notice the bunch of random characters that would come out, right? So this is a basic usage of a random number generator. Again, if you want it to be purely pseudo random with some kind of seed, you need to call sran, right? So scaling in here, uh, what you have seen earlier is basically trying to scale a random number generator to some values, right? The scaling is basically a procedure for adjusting the random number produced to fall into a specific range. So in our case, in our previous example here, we want it to fall between 0 and 25 because we're dealing with 26 characters that we want to be generating, right? So if we want to scale it into a different set, right? So suppose we want to scaling random numbers to lie in the range of 0 to uh, 1.0. Basically we would use random, right? We call the function random and we'll divide it with the random maximum value, right? So so by dividing the random maximum value random whatever is being generated, so if the random number generator generates 32,000 for example, and that's the maximum that you can generate, right? So it will divide itself by 32, right? So whatever values they create is between 0.0 to 1.0, right? If you want it to generate something of an integer value between 0 and n, then you have to mode the value with n plus 1, right? So this is exactly the same as our example program we did earlier, where you want to generate 26 characters. So we mode it with 26, right? And we're gonna generate a letter from 0 to 25 basically, right? And it's pretty easy to use, right? And if we're scaling a number integer value between 0, that's and it's somewhat a double value that we want, then we'll just divide by a random maximum value and times it with some kind of n, right? This would give another method to produce random numbers in that sense, right? So these two methods basically work. This would basically return a double value and then basically change it into an integer or scale it into an integer, right? So again, let's go into the common programming errors, right? Passing incorrect data types, right? Make sure when you're using variables, you are passing the correct data type between functions, and this is a common error. People create functions and declare the parameters as a different data type than the ones that they actually declare, right? Uh, uh, so some of the other errors is declaring the same variable names in calling and call functions, right? So when you have variables that are the same name, you tend to confuse them and how you use them, right? A change to one local variable basically does not change the value in another, right? Because the scope are different, right? So you have to be careful if they have the same name in that sense, right? What do you actually intend to do, right? And which variable do you want to change, right? Because if you're changing the local variable just because they have the same name, it doesn't mean the calling function in the main function would change value as well, right? Because they sit in different scopes. So assigning the same name to a local and a global variable, right? This can be a bit confusing. Of course, you can use the double colon operator, right? But make sure you really want to know what you're doing, and and if you want to access those global variables, make sure you have the double colon here, right? To identify which one is the global, right? Scope resolution operator here, right? To define or to explicitly mention which variable that you want to deal with, right? Another problem with this programming error is omitting a call function prototype. If you omit this, the function basically that is not recognized. And terminating a function header line with a semicolon, basically this also is a problem. Sometimes you write a function, a function does not have a semicolon, right? It basically has a name. It will have a bracket, right, where you put the parameters in, and it doesn't have a semicolon, right? You can have a parenthesis basically to state where the function starts, but it doesn't have a semicolon. If you do put a semicolon, then you find that you have problems there, right? Forgetting to include the data type of a function parameter within the function header line would also be a problem there, right? And cause some programming errors. So be aware of these kind of things, right? So please read through the summary with the slides given, right? And there is also some kind of something for you to practice in if you wanna get a better understanding of the code. I suggest you try it out, right? If you want to get a better understanding of the topics discussed here, I suggest you try it out. So I'll see you again. This wraps it up for chapter 6. The first series was about the part 1 of it, and this is the second series. Next we'll continue next week with chapter 7. I'll see you again, and have a nice day and have a nice weekend, everyone.